can. If we cannot get to your question as this goes forward, we will capture your questions and we will reply to you after the webinar, or you may email questions to COVID-19 consulting@osumc.edu. Here with me are experts from the Ohio State Wexner Medical Center. Dr. Andy Thomas is Chief Clinical Officer and Senior Associate Vice President for Health Sciences at the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. Dr. Thomas has worked on the front lines of Wexner Medical Center's response and management of COVID-19 and serves as an expert in providing best practices consulting on a safe return to the workplace. Dr. Ian Gonzenhauser is Chief Quality and Patient Safety Officer at the Medical Center. He provides leadership and oversight of quality care practices and patient safety across the multiple units of the Wexner Medical Center. Dr. Gonzenhauser has led the efforts to provide safe and high quality care to patients amid COVID. Next, we have Dr. Raman Malapalli, and he is the S. Robert Davis Chair of the Department of Internal Medicine at Ohio State Wexner's Medical Center. Dr. Malapalli leads the Convalescent Plaza program efforts, which he will overview with you shortly. And finally, Dr. Carlos Manifestudo is the co-chair of OSU's COVID-19 Task Force Clinical Trials Working Group, the principal investigator for the Blaze 1 trial and the Active 2 trial at Ohio State, which he will also explain shortly when he talks a little bit later in this webinar. So welcome to all of you. And we will begin with Dr. Thomas. Dr. Thomas, nice to see you again. Yesterday, you were quoted in the Columbus Dispatch addressing the significant increase in COVID-19 cases nationally and right here in Ohio. Can you share with us the latest data and trends that you are seeing?
Yeah, Gail, normally I would say I'd be happy to, but I'm not very happy to on a day like this. We are having a really difficult period of time. I'm going to share my screen here. Many of you are familiar from being on these webinars in the past with the state public health advisory system. It's a color-coded map of counties across the state that looks at 7 different indicators of COVID activity in each local region. Some of these indicators are leading indicators, looking at symptoms people are presenting with to the emergency department. Some of these are kind of real-time indicators in terms of cases per 100,000 over the past 2 weeks. And some of them are what we call lagging indicators. Those are indicators like hospitalizations, which may happen 7 to 14 days after a patient becomes diagnosed with the virus. They may not get sick enough to need to be in the hospital till at least a week or more out from the infection. So what you can see on the screen now is our map from the week of October 1st. So this is distributed on a weekly basis, typically every Thursday. And on October 1st, you can see there was a little bit of a spread in Southwest Ohio and a couple of random counties around. But as we walk through the month of October, you can imagine yellow is the best until there's a vaccine. Well, no one gets to green. Yellow, orange, red, and then purple is by far the worst color. As you can see, it gets more orange, gets more red as we go through the month of October. And then as we get to early November, pretty much as of the release from last week, you can see, I believe it was almost 80% of the state's population is living in a red county. There is no part of the state of Ohio that is free from this virus. It's very different than where we were in the spring when it was mainly something that the metropolitan areas of the state were worried about, some of the urban and suburban areas, but a lot of the smaller town and rural communities across the state really did not have a significant amount of the virus. And that was actually true even through most of the summer. So what we're seeing now is spread on a much more widespread basis. The one metric that I look at the most is this top left metric here. This is the Franklin County, the 7 metrics of Franklin County from last week. This is the number of cases per 100,000 over the past 2 weeks. The CDC says that under or anything above 100 is high incidence. Franklin County was 267 per 100,000 over the past 2 weeks. Some of our rural counties, especially in the western and northwestern part of the state, have been in the 400 or 500 per 100,000 individuals over the past 2 weeks. In fact, I've been on a number of calls with county health department leaders across the state that are saying, you know, they've had more cases in the last 2 or 3 weeks than they have combined since March. So this is something that it's a major kind of, if this were a civil defense issue, if this were, there's all sorts of analogies you can make, this would be an all hands on deck sort of moment. Yesterday, my fellow zone leads, Bob Wiley, who's my counterpart at Cleveland Clinic, and Rick Lofgren, who's the CEO at UC Health, and Bruce Vanderhoff, who's the new Chief Medical Officer for the Ohio Department of Health, did a press conference with the State House News Press Corps, really highlighting this as a concern, not just because of the number of cases, but what we're seeing in terms of the number of hospitalizations. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that, just if I can spread the word even to the folks watching this webinar so that they can spread the word to others about how serious this is. It's very important. So when I talk about the zones, Zone 1 is all the way from Toledo through the Cleveland, Akron, Canton, Youngstown areas. Zone 2 is here in Central Ohio, Region 4, and then Regions 7 and 8, which are the more southern and southeastern parts of the state, more rural areas. And then Zone 3 is Regions 3 and 6, which are essentially the Dayton and Cincinnati metropolitan areas and the surrounding counties. What we're seeing in terms of hospitalizations in the state is on this graph. The blue line are total patients in the hospital on any given day. So this goes back to April when the outbreak, we started tracking data from early April. The green line are number of patients in the ICU on any given day with COVID, and the red line are number of patients on the ventilator. As you can see here as a state, we've reached 2,747 patients in the hospital as of today. One of the scariest facts that I can think of related to this epidemic is last Thursday, on November 5th, 2 days after Election Day, on last Thursday, we crossed 2,000 patients in the hospital for the first time. Today, we have 2,747. That's an amazing increase in just a 5 or 6 day period of time. If you look, this trend goes across each of the zones. You can see Zone 1, Zone 2, and Zone 3. All three zones are at the highest point they've been at any time since the beginning of the pandemic. In fact, Zone 2, which is the data that I'm responsible for and the hospitals that we touch base with now on a daily basis with surge calls every morning at 9 a.m., last Monday, November 2nd, we crossed 400 patients in the zone in the hospital with COVID. By Friday, we were at 500. Today, we crossed over 600 patients in the zone 8 days later after we crossed 400 patients in the zone. That's a 50% increase in 8 days. That is not sustainable for us to be able to continue to provide all sorts of non-COVID related services to patients. I used to think, and my zone lead colleagues and hospital leaders around the state thought we were maybe 4 to 6 weeks out of continued surge in patients where it would start to eat into the ability to care for non-COVID patients. Unfortunately, we think that now is more like 2 to 3 weeks if this is not turned around. One of the concerns that we have is that as a lagging indicator, hospitalizations track behind actual cases being diagnosed by usually 1 to 2 weeks, as I mentioned. Since you don't get into the hospital till typically 7 to 14 days after you become ill. And our concern is if we see continued rising cases moving forward, then hospitalizations will continue to rise for another couple of weeks until after we see the cases peak and start to come down. So our goal yesterday was really sounding the alarm bells with the press. And I think the governor this week is going to certainly raise more, I think, concerns around this. But it really comes down to leaders in their own community. We're doing calls now with county commissioners, mayors, business leaders in each county across the state, trying to get local individuals engaged in this fight to get people really to do those same simple things we've been talking about since the beginning of this. It's wearing a mask, keeping your distance from others that you don't live with, washing your hands, and most of all, avoiding large crowds, avoiding large gatherings. Many of you as business leaders know what you've done in your office setting, your manufacturing setting, your retail setting. We don't think that a lot of these infections are happening because people are going shopping at the grocery store or going shopping at the hardware store or even going out to dinner. 95% of the restaurants here in Franklin County are doing a great job at actually making sure that the rules that are in place are followed. Now, there are obviously exceptions to that, and that's something I think that will be looked at by the state more over the next couple of weeks. What it really comes down to is people's personal behavior and their personal time. It's what are they doing in their basement? What are they doing in their living room? What are they doing in their backyard? We hear stories from school superintendents of all the parents coming to their child's sporting event. Everybody wears a mask when they're in the stands. Then they all leave the game and go over to the captain's house for pizza, and none of the parents have masks on. None of the students have masks on. It's when people let their guard down. And it's fair to say we all have fatigue from COVID at this point. But you have to understand that what you do isn't just impacting your own health. It's impacting the health of your loved ones. It's impacting the health of your neighbors. And most of all, if you know anyone that works in the healthcare setting, who's a nurse, who's a pharmacist, a physician, anyone who, even people who work in environmental services or work in our labs, draw blood for a living, whatever they might do in a healthcare setting, those are folks that are on the front line. And through your behaviors, you're putting them at risk. Because frankly, our hospitals are getting more full with COVID patients, and it's not sustainable unless we see a change in the number of cases and therefore the number of hospitalizations that we see in the state. So like I said, Gail, normally I would say I'm happy to present this data. This time around, I'm not quite as happy as I typically am to present the data, but it's really an important message that we need to share with all those on this call and all those around the state about how important it is that we have to bend this curve. Or else, given that we're going into the Thanksgiving season and into the Christmas season, people are going to have to change their behavior, or else this is not going to get any better moving forward. So,
Dr. Thomas, thank you for the update. Sobering that it is. We appreciate it. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Gonzenhauser. Dr. Gonzenhauser, is there any new information to share about clinical recovery and patient safety? And Dr. Thomas talked about how things are getting a bit crowded in all the hospitals, and I know that has to be a concern.
Yeah, thank you, Gail. It certainly is, and I'm gonna keep from talking too much about sort of new treatment modalities and how that's changing the nature of COVID, because we're going to get a lot of information from two experts just after I speak on the call today. But certainly, you know, as the numbers that Dr. Thomas shared with you continue to rise and create what is really a daunting picture for us. You can imagine what an organization like ours is focused on right now. We're focused not only on our clinical mission and how we can continue to put processes and protocols and programs in place to serve the people and the patients of Central Ohio communities. But we're also really focused on many of the same things that you as business owners are focused on. Right now, our focus is on if these numbers continue to grow, if this demand continues to mount, how do we provide services to meet that demand and meet the healthcare needs of the people of Central Ohio? And that means a few different things. It means not only looking at our ability to provide capacity for services just by nature of what we do every day. It also means looking very, very closely and very cautiously at how we keep our workforce healthy and how we keep our workforce at work, which I think is the question that many of you have as well. How in this environment of mounting caseloads in the community, increased number of people who are testing positive and needing to go into quarantine, how do we try and maintain our staff and our workforce? Because as we expand our services, that's really one of the linchpins that this all rests on. We absolutely have to be able to keep our workforce and our staff numbers up. So we continue to look at how to effectively communicate and educate the precautions that Dr. Thomas mentioned, how we continue to communicate to people that there's a certain amount of restraint and self-control and precaution that they need to really put in place, avoiding those large gatherings, avoiding even those small gatherings with non-household contacts where you may become exposed, looking at utilization of masking and hand hygiene and social distancing, and of course, testing as well. We are looking, at how we consider the use of rapid tests versus PCR tests and the different utilities that they both offer. And just continue to maintain that focus again on workforce health, workforce safety, and obviously treating our folks when they come in so that we can get them back to their normal life and back to work as soon as possible. So as far as new updates or new findings when it comes to the treatment of COVID, I'm going to defer that to Doctors Malampalli and Malvestuto, who are going to speak on really some pretty interesting and exciting cutting edge technologies that we are working on here at OSU as part of the national effort. But as far as what we're doing right now, many of the same things that you're doing in your businesses, and that's why we are here and available to continue to try and help you with that planning. We're looking at absolutely maximizing everybody's ability to stay in the environment of care if that's what they do, and how we keep them healthy. We still continue to use contact tracing programs here on site to identify anybody who may be at risk. And look at the value of that, again, to try and only keep people out of work and under quarantine if absolutely necessary. That can be at times case-by-case evaluation to really understand the nature of an exposure. I'd say if anything has changed, it's how critical we are of exposure events to really tease out the fine details of what specifically defined that potential contact or exposure, how it qualifies in terms of low, moderate, or high risk for transmission, and then what the appropriate resulting action may be if it truly means quarantine is necessary or if there are alternatives. That's had a big impact on our ability to keep more people working and something that I'm sure will continue. Gail, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzenhauser. And I would like to remind everyone who is on this webinar this afternoon that if you do have questions for any of the doctors, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom webinar page, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. The clinical care recovery update transitions us into one of today's featured topics, which is convalescent plasma. We're pleased to have with us Dr. Malampalli to give us an update on the convalescent plasma program and how Ohio State's efforts are helping to address the increase in COVID cases. Welcome, Dr. Malampalli.
Thank you, Gail, and certainly wonderful to be here and share some of the information with our audience. Certainly want to highlight Dr. Thomas's stunning information on the rise in number of cases of COVID-19. And I think that really underscores the importance of us here at Ohio State to implement and advance some of these newer treatment modalities for COVID-19. And so I'd like to share with you on the next slide some of the areas that we'd like to cover. First of all, we'd like to go over, next slide. The convalescent plasma program and where that's at. I'd also like to go ahead and touch a little bit on antigen testing. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Malvastuto, who's going to talk about some of the exciting clinical trials for COVID-19 that are ongoing here at Ohio State University Medical Center. On the next slide, it showcases really that we really are very collaborative here at Ohio State. This certainly could not be possible without my wonderful colleagues here who've partnered with us in a very special way to go ahead and implement some of these newer treatments for COVID-19 and advance some of the clinical trials. People from all different areas within the medical system have contributed in this regard. On the next slide, I'd like to go ahead and talk specifically about the convalescent plasma program. And just by way of background, very simplistically, what is plasma? So really, when you give blood, whole blood, it's comprised largely of water, but also cells. So if you remove the cells or the formed elements from whole blood, you're going to be left with basically plasma. And that's important because the plasma, of course, has the antibodies that will fight and interact with viruses. And so the first step in the overall process begins with pre-screening. And this overall process was really implemented and worked out with a number of, again, great colleagues, Dr. Jim Rocco, who was the interim dean, Dr. Gerard Lazansky, who's the head of our laboratory, Dr. Scott Scrape, who runs our transfusion program, and also Dr. Sonal Panu, who's on the front line. She's a critical care intensivist who is actually delivering the plasma to our patients here at Ohio State. So as I mentioned, the first step is pre-screening, and I will show you shortly a website for potential donors who have recovered from COVID-19, who've had a positive test in the past, or those who have an antibody that's positive, indicating that they've been exposed to COVID-19. Those are candidates who can come in and donate plasma, and they have to be 14 days symptom-free before donation. The blood also, of course, is screened for other markers that might make them relatively not the best candidates for donation, but several tests are done at the screening level when the donors come in. A sample of blood is obtained and that testing is done, and then the donor is notified. Eventually, the donor will come into Ohio State here and will undergo a process over a few hours to donate the plasma. That's then processed, and then it is then stored and delivered to the patient as indicated. And a large number of patients indeed have gotten plasma for therapy. And in fact, we've given over 500 units to our patients here at Ohio State. The next slide shows a little bit about what are these patients like who've received plasma. Well, by and large, they're a little older and they're largely male. We've had to, certainly in the first few months, give a large number of units to our individuals from correctional facilities. And about a third of our patients have been prisoners. And we've been pretty successful in giving plasma very early on. The few studies that have come out show that it's best to give it within the first few days of a diagnosis of COVID-19. And indeed, as you can see from the slide, the average time is about 3 days from diagnosis. The next slide shows a little bit more about these patients who've received plasma. You can see about half these patients were in the intensive care unit. And indeed, about a third, just over a third, were on ventilators. They're usually in the hospital for about 2 weeks overall with COVID-19. And importantly, what I wanted to showcase to you is that we have an impressive survival rate. About 80%, almost 80% of our patients do live after getting convalescent plasma. And specifically, those patients who are very, very sick in the intensive care units, over almost 60% of those patients actually do very well. They get out of the ICU, whether or not they're on a ventilator, and about half of those patients you can see below also survive despite being on mechanical ventilation, are shown there as MV. So this is important because when you get in the ICU, that's when the inflection point is, when patients are very, very sick and their mortality rates overall in intensive care units is 20–30%. So we're showing you actually a fairly good numbers in terms of outcomes in these very sick patients. The next slide want to show a little bit more about in terms of what happens when you give these patients plasma. As I mentioned earlier, the goal of plasma is to give them really the antibodies from patients who've recovered so they can actually do better and have better outcomes. In a large number of patients, we've given plasma to upwards about 250 patients. And of those, we looked at about 213 patients. And what we found is that those patients who didn't have antibodies before they got the plasma, but they converted, they became antibody positive after screening, they did very well. Their survival was about 89%, as shown here on the table. In contrast, those patients who were antibody positive before they got the plasma and then remained so after, they didn't do quite as well, about 77%. And those who remained antibody negative despite getting plasma didn't do as well, as you can see there below on the lower portion of the slide. So overall, patients who get plasma do very well. This is not a controlled, randomized scientific study, and this is just the data that we've observed thus far. Next slide. So I want to really highlight, it's really, really important and driven by the availability of donors. We've had a number of very generous donors. Some donors have given multiple units to us. As I mentioned before, we've so far have given about 500 units of plasma to our patients with COVID-19. I really encourage you in your community, if you can certainly direct those individuals who have recovered from this serious infection to really log on to our website as shown here below and really donate, because that's especially with what Dr. Thomas has shared with you, with the rising numbers of patients, those who are being admitted and certainly into the intensive care units. Convalescent plasma is really a cornerstone for our care of our patients with this severe viral illness. Next slide. I want to also touch very briefly on antibody testing. I know many of you have heard about this through the lay public and through the news media. Obviously, this is somewhat controversial in some ways, but thanks to Dr. Lazansky, he was able to go ahead and set up these assays several months ago. We started our convalescent plasma program last April, I would add, and about the same time, we also embarked on setting up antibody testing for our patients to see whether or not they've been exposed. Next slide. And to make this very simple, when you do antibody testing, how it occurs in the laboratory is as follows. Basically, you on the far left, you have a plastic tissue culture plate that basically has with it in all these wells bound to it is a certain fragment of the virus. In this case, it's the viral spike protein that's basically bound onto the plate. And then the patient comes in and donates blood. And if that patient should have antibodies to the virus, those antibodies will bind to this protein or this spike protein that's on the plate, and that'll cause and trigger a reaction that can then be quantified and measured to some degree. And that will indicate whether or not the patient has antibody titers and in turn represents whether or not they've been exposed previously to COVID-19. And on the next slide, you can see that the test is validated. It actually is very useful, has a very high sensitivity rate, captures over 92% of patients who are positive, and is fairly specific with very few false positives. So it's a fairly useful test. We're doing about 10 to 15 tests daily, mainly with the indication to assess utility of our convalescent plasma program. So I will stop at this point. Happy to entertain any questions, and then we'll go ahead and transition over to Dr. Malvastuto to explain more on some of the exciting clinical trials with new therapeutics for COVID-19 as well. Over.
Dr. Malampalli, before we move on, a couple questions. One being, can you explain the process of how a donor gives that plasma? Is it like giving blood, or is it more complicated than that? I'm sorry, you're not muted. You're muted. There we go.
Thank you, Dale. That's a good question. So as I mentioned earlier, the donor will come in and will get screened whether or not they've had COVID-19 and is symptom-free, and then will come in and get additional screening to make sure that they have compatibility to donate blood like they would any blood donor. And will come into Ohio State and then will undergo a process where they will have their blood donated and they'll be processed for obtain the plasma fraction, as I mentioned earlier, and that will be stored. And currently we're partnering with a blood bank, company, Versity, that basically will harvest that and process the blood. And I would also add, part of the testing is to make sure, for other infections like hepatitis and HIV, those are all screened as well as part of the process. And the patient, the donor certainly would be able to go home and, the same day. It's a matter of a few hours to get this done. So that infrastructure is all set up here at Ohio State for that.
Is Ohio State the only hospital that is taking patients who want to donate plasma?
Well, we're one of a number of centers that are available to capture donors, and but our system here is been established for about 6-7 months now, and it's very efficient, and it's been really indispensable in terms of caring for these patients.
It sounds like it has been very successful, and that's a wonderful tool that you have been able to use.
Absolutely. I think we were actually the first program, certainly in Central Ohio, to have convalescent plasma started here. So and certainly have made an impact, as you can see.
Great, thank you, Dr. Malampalli. And now I am going to turn to Dr. Malvastuto. He's going to give us an overview of monoclonal antibody therapy and the role it plays in addressing COVID-19. Dr. Malvastuto, I'm not sure I'm saying, is it monoclonal? Is that the correct pronunciation for this?
Yes, it's monoclonal antibodies and monoclonal neutralizing antibodies. So I'll explain a little bit about what we mean.
Yes, please.
So if I can have the slides. So good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the therapeutics and prevention clinical trials that we've embarked on through a lot of work, but I think we are now getting to the point where they're yielding results that will have a significant impact on the treatment of COVID-19. Next slide. So to start off, before I delve into the monoclonal antibodies, I just wanted to give a very quick overview of the clinical course of COVID-19 and specifically, what happens at the two main stages for COVID-19. Initially, when a person is exposed to the virus and then they acquire the infection, there is a period of significant viral replication. The virus is invading cells in the airways and in other systems of the body, and it replicates in large quantities. It is in these early stages of disease that antiviral medications, and this applies to any virus, will have the most impact because if we're able to then stop the viral replication, then the progression of the disease will also be stopped or at least slowed down. As we move further along with progression of the disease, then patients experience more significant symptoms, and a number of patients will progress to more severe disease to the point that they may require supplemental oxygen and may even progress to the point of critical illness with respiratory failure, multi-organ failure. And at that point, obviously, these patients require hospitalization and very high-level treatment. It is in these later stages where what we see is that is causing the majority of the complications is related to inflammation, and the inflammation is a natural reaction of the body to the virus in trying to fight off the virus. But when this inflammation becomes just exacerbated, then it can be damaging. So a lot of the treatments we now understand at the point when a patient is already hospitalized and has more severe disease may be actually more dependent on being able to control that inflammation. So in early stages of disease, then the antivirals will have the biggest impact. They will still help to reduce the viral replication in later stages, but at that point, the main driver of clinical outcomes is inflammation. And the types of immune modulating therapies that reduce inflammation will likely play a more important role. So it's important that we understand that from the beginning. So when we talk about antiviral therapies, so I think most of the audience is familiar with remdesivir, a medication that we use for hospitalized patients, but has its most impact early on in the disease. And I'm going to talk about the monoclonal antibodies and the role that they have. Next slide, please. So here at OSU, we've deliberately selected a number of clinical trials to participate in that had a very good preclinical data supporting them, and that we thought offered some of the most promising therapeutics for our patient population. And we made sure that we could target the entire spectrum of COVID-19 disease so that we have clinical trials that are on the prevention side. So, for example, our vaccine trial, we are one of the sites for the AstraZeneca vaccine trial, which incidentally just enrolled its first participant today here at our site, as well as treatments for prophylaxis. So for those people who may have been exposed to somebody in their own household who has COVID-19, how do we protect them? So there is a neutralizing antibody trial to actually see if these monoclonal neutralizing antibodies would be effective at preventing the acquisition of COVID-19 in those people who are exposed to somebody with COVID-19. So that's the CoVPN 3502 trial that Dr. Sully Brill is the principal investigator on. We have also the treatment trials that I'm going to talk a little bit about. The first one was, and these are outpatient trials, so the BLAZE-1 trial, and this is a trial that it's a phase 2 trial that was evaluating the Lilly neutralizing antibody that was initially called LY CoV555 and now has the name bamlanivimab. Sorry, I'm still getting used to the name. As well as the ACTIV-2 trial, which is a large NIH-sponsored trial that is meant, and it's an adaptive design trial that is actually meant to evaluate the most promising treatment option. So rather than evaluating a single treatment, this trial will have multiple arms evaluating several different treatment options in the same clinical trial platform. On the inpatient side, then we have a number of antivirals that are being evaluated. So also there is the neutralizing antibody combination manufactured by Regeneron, and that's the Regeneron 2066 trial for hospitalized patients. The Dr. Matt Exline and Maddie Sobani are currently leading, as well as the AT03 trial, which is evaluating an oral nucleotide analog trial for patients who are hospitalized but don't have very severe illness. As you can see, then our clinical trials cover the entire spectrum of disease, and I haven't even gone into also the trials on immune modulators and anti-inflammatories for hospitalized patients as well. So we've been very deliberate and very careful about selecting the trials that would span the entire spectrum of disease and that we thought would have the biggest impact for the treatment of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So let me go into the monoclonal antibodies and explain a little bit about this. So here, just a very quick review of what a representation of the SARS-CoV-2 virus is, the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19. And if you look on the left at this cross section, there are these structures that are protruding from the surface of the virus. And these are very aptly named the spike protein. So this spike protein on the surface of the virus is an essential structure of the virus because it's what the virus will utilize to be able to bind to cells, to attach to cells, to then enter and then be able to complete its replication cycle. If we disrupt the binding of the spike protein to the cell, the receptors on the cell, then that process cannot happen. And then we are able to stop the replication of the virus. And that's exactly what the monoclonal antibodies are meant to do. Next slide, please. So here in this representation, you can see on the left the host cell. So this could be a cell in the airway of a person, or even in the GI tract, where we also find this. There is a receptor called the ACE2 receptor, and this is what the virus will bind to. The spike protein of the virus that you can see on the bottom of the figure here will bind to the ACE2 receptor, and that red area in the middle is the receptor binding domain. After it binds to that receptor, it's able to then enter the cell and continue its replication cycle. On the right, you can see that an antibody will then recognize the spike protein, and specifically it will attach to certain parts of the receptor binding domain. So once that happens and the antibody is bound to that receptor binding domain on the spike protein, then the virus is unable to then attach to the ACE2 receptor on the host cell, thereby stopping that process and stopping replication of the virus. Next slide. So what are these SARS-CoV-2 neutralizing antibodies? So they can be produced in a number of different ways. So we know that they are produced naturally after a person has been exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And this is actually what allows the infection to eventually end. That process is stopped after we produce our own antibodies that will then stop the replication cycle and will then allow our bodies to recover from COVID-19. what we also try to do is to then induce our bodies to produce these antibodies through vaccines. And in a vaccine, then we essentially expose our immune system to a form of the spike protein. So we actually know the genetic code of the spike protein, and we're able to clone and actually produce synthetically forms of the spike protein alone, that then in a vaccine, what we hope is that the immune system will produce these neutralizing antibodies after being exposed to the vaccine. So this is another form that we produce these. They can also be administered in a passive manner through the transfusion of convalescent plasma. And this is what Dr. Malampalli was explaining before. So we essentially take those neutralizing antibodies that have been produced by patients who have recovered from COVID-19, and then we hope that by giving the plasma, that the mix of those neutralizing antibodies that may be in the plasma, that we're able to then give that to somebody who is acutely ill, so that then the replication of the virus can be stopped. And what can also be done is these monoclonal antibodies can be synthetically produced. So because and the way that this was done is actually by identifying the neutralizing antibodies from the early survivors of COVID-19. Once all those antibodies were evaluated and tested, and they selected the most potent ones, and then they were able to clone them and actually synthetically produce large, pure quantities of the monoclonal antibody, which was then used in clinical trials to then evaluate its efficacy. And that's what I'll go into. Next slide, please. So overall, what is the role of these monoclonal neutralizing antibodies? So we think that they are beneficial for a number of different reasons. They can serve as a critical bridge until vaccines are widely available, because they allow us to essentially provide that passive immunization for patients, and in being able to then stop the virus. We also know that a number of people who have certain conditions that don't allow their immune systems to work quite as effectively, those are the patients that are most vulnerable, and they're also less likely to be able to mount an adequate immune response and to produce antibodies through vaccination. So for those patients, then monoclonal neutralizing antibodies may be very important, and it may provide that protection and also so either treatment or also a form of protection. And they also offer immediate protection for those exposed or unvaccinated, and that's the idea of the post-exposure prophylaxis. So being able to give these monoclonal antibodies to somebody who has been exposed to the virus so that they don't acquire the infection. There are many monoclonal antibodies, as I explained, that were isolated from the convalescent serum for COVID-19 survivors. And they've been engineered in human mouse models and in many other systems. So now over the last decade or so, the technology has been perfected to such a degree that we are now able to produce monoclonal antibodies that are very specific to different viruses. This was done recently by one of these pharmaceutical companies just in the last couple of years against the Ebola virus. And in a very short period of time, they've been able to do the same thing for COVID-19. It's also important to note that neutralizing antibodies, these monoclonal neutralizing antibodies, can be engineered. We know a lot about what we need to do, and we can make certain modifications that can actually change certain characteristics of these monoclonal antibodies. So we can extend their half-life, for example, by making very simple changes. We know that in the early studies, so in studies that were done in vitro assays and also in animal studies, the data was actually very compelling. And this is actually what prompted us to decide to bring these trials to Ohio State. We thought that the preclinical data was very promising, and it made sense for us to be able to provide it to our patients. So, there's a lot of discussion as to, so who should receive these, who should we be targeting? But in particular, patients who are most vulnerable and most likely to progress to more severe disease may be the ideal candidates to receive monoclonal antibodies as a form of treatment and or as a form of protection. So in particular, elderly patients, otherwise poor vaccine candidates, and then patients who would benefit from rapid protection after exposure. Next slide, please. So this is just an overview of the BLAZE-1 clinical trial. So we were the site for this clinical trial. This was, in fact, our first outpatient clinical trial for COVID-19. And I can tell you that it took a tremendous amount of work to set up everything so that we could do this safely, that we could conduct this trial in our medical center, and which implied then bringing in patients who were acutely ill with COVID-19 and making sure that we did this safely without exposing other patients or the staff. And so it was a lot of work and a very important collaboration to actually be able to put this in place. And being able to do this work then has allowed us to then open other important trials as well. So in this particular trial, very briefly, this was a phase 2 trial, then looking at the neutralizing antibody produced by the company Eli Lilly. And in this trial, they evaluated 3 different doses of the monoclonal neutralizing antibody. So one was a 700 milligram dose, a 2800 milligram dose, and a 7000 milligram dose compared to placebo. So participants were randomized to receive either the placebo or one of these doses. Later on, there was also a second antibody that was used. And that second antibody now given in combination, again, also compared to placebo, to see if is a combination of 2 neutralizing antibodies that target maybe slightly different areas on that receptor binding domain. Do they work better together than just having a single one? And then there was another part that actually then focused specifically looking at patients who had risk factors for complications for a separate analysis. And this study was done. We were a part of that trial. And the data was recently just published in the New England Journal. And it's also what led to this neutralizing antibody to be approved for emergency use authorization by FDA. So after the preliminary data was shown that this was effective, so the company then applied for emergency use authorization, which was just granted yesterday. Next slide, please. So after that trial, and then we moved on to this larger phase 2, phase 3 trial. So it's a combined phase 2 and phase 3 trial. And this is the ACTIV-2 trial. And this is part of the ACTIV collaboration, which stands for Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines. This is a public-private partnership. And what it's meant to do is, this is an NIH-sponsored collaboration. And what it's meant to do is to bring the most promising therapeutic options for patients who are not hospitalized and to evaluate them in the same clinical trial platform. So, and it's an adaptive design trial, which then allows us to look at the preliminary results of the trial as it's ongoing. And if those results look promising, then the trial shifts to a larger phase 3 trial. So initially, the phase 2 trial enrolls 110 participants per study arm. This is also placebo-controlled. And then if that's shown to be promising, then it enrolls 1,000 participants. And multiple treatments are evaluated in the same treatment platform. And the first treatment that is actually being evaluated in this trial is the Lilly neutralizing antibody, bamlanivimab, that I was just talking about. And based on the data from BLAZE-1, then the dose that was selected is a 700 milligram, which is what we've been using. And so we've been enrolling this trial very successfully. We're actually one of the top enrollers in the country for this trial. Next slide, please. So as I explained, this is a randomized placebo-controlled trial. It's an adaptive design trial, which allows us to then test multiple treatment options through the same clinical trial platform, as I discussed. Next slide. So we've done a lot of work to actually promote these trials, to actually let the public know that these trials exist. We've worked, with obviously we've shared the information with our own providers in the OSU system, but we've done this widely, and this is the website actually for this trial. That's riseabovecovid.org. You can go in there, and it's actually very well designed. The team has done a great job of making it very accessible to anybody who's interested to learn about the trial and know what it's about. And it actually allows participants to then find the site anywhere in the US. And actually, this is going to be an international trial, and their closest site that they will put them in contact with them. So through this work, then we've been very successful at enrolling participants. On Monday, we enrolled our 20th participant, and then we keep enrolling, and this trial is currently ongoing. Next slide, please. Let me shift gears very quickly just to mention the prevention trial. So on the prevention side, we have the CoVPN 3502 trial. So in this trial, we're also using a monoclonal antibody combination. In this case, it's actually a combination manufactured by the company Regeneron, and it's a cocktail of two different neutralizing antibodies. But in this case, instead of this being an IV infusion, it's a subcutaneous injection at a lower dose than what's used for treatment of patients who are actively infected. And this is meant for household contacts of patients who have tested positive for COVID-19. So as we are seeing, and as Dr. Thomas mentioned, then a lot of the cases that we're seeing we're seeing a lot of community transmission. And this transmission, usually what happens is there may be one person in the household, and then a number of other people in the house, or all of the people living in the household, may become sick with COVID. So if somebody tests positive for COVID in the household, and then their household contacts, if they enroll within 96 hours, then they're randomized to receive the injection for the neutralizing antibody. And the idea is to see will this help us to prevent the acquisition of COVID-19, or even in those who do acquire the infection, then do they have milder disease? So this trial is ongoing. We started enrolling last week, and it's currently open. Next slide, please. And just the last two slides, I also wanted to mention that, so we are also actively involved in the vaccine trial. So we are currently a site for the AstraZeneca trial. And this is a phase 3 trial that's enrolling 30,000 participants. I think everyone has probably heard in the last couple of days about the preliminary data from the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which is an mRNA vaccine, slightly different. It's a different platform from the AstraZeneca vaccine. But what I wanted to mention is that for all of these vaccines, the preliminary data, the data that is actually looked at the lab results that usually correlate with protective immunity, those were all very positive. And that's bearing out, and it's what we're seeing with Pfizer, which was shown to be more than 90% effective. And now, so AstraZeneca is ongoing. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide on this. So this is the trial. It's a placebo-controlled trial. So this is obviously for patients who are not infected with COVID, to see if it will help to protect them. It's a 2-dose vaccine. So the first dose when patients come in, and then the second dose 28 days later. So we'll know at the end of this study, how effective it is. But the hope is that there will be more than one vaccine that will be effective.
Dr. Malvasudo, thank you very much. We appreciate that, and we appreciate everyone who has been on today's webinar. These therapies are obviously a very bright spot in what we are seeing here in Central Ohio, and offering this not just to the folks here in Central Ohio, but around the state. Thank you. And Dr. Thomas, I'm going to turn to you to wrap this up. As we mentioned in previous webinars, that Ohio State offers services to employers about COVID-19 and how best to utilize Ohio State to keep their businesses and their employees safe. Can you outline those, please?
I sure can. Thank you, Gail. The services really vary, anything from the webinars like you're seeing today, which are obviously free of charge, up to a variety of services, what I would say would be a menu of services based on your needs at the corporate level, commercial level. So that could be anything from a train the trainer approach we've taken for the role of what we're calling a COVID safety officer, where there's online training and also some personalized training for individuals so that someone in your company could become a COVID safety officer. In addition, we can do some consulting by phone or on site where we have either infectious disease physicians or infection control practitioner nurses, epidemiology nurses, advising you either over the phone or on site at your company on the various ways that you can protect your staff and you can protect your employees and customers. So if you are interested, the website or the email that Gail had shared earlier, COVID-19 consulting at osumc.edu is the email address to use. If you would like to reach out to our business development team, we'd be happy to set up time to speak with you about what your needs are and help you figure out how to keep your workplace safe.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. And as we wrap this up, I also want to mention that next week, this will be on November 17th at 1 p.m. We have Dr. Sue Kolatar back with us, and she will give an update on the vaccination trials that have dominated the news cycle the past 24 hours. So look for information and invitations for this webinar in your inbox soon. I want to thank our experts for their time. I want to thank each one of you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope that you will join us for future webinars. Again, if you would like to connect with our team, there's the website, COVID-19 Consulting at osumc.edu. Again, COVID-19 Consulting at osumc.edu. Thank you all again. Be safe, be well.